When I read Sebastian Junger's book about war in Afghanistan and also watched the associated documentary Restrepo, I thought, strangely enough, about Socrates, Plato, and Frodo. Now, by referencing Socrates and Plato, I'm not trying to be a egg-headed academic who sees a horror of war and what people are going through in war, and then think of some esoteric connection that exists between that and some ancient philosophy. And in talking about Frodo and the Lord of the Rings, I'm not trying to be flippant of talking about the seriousness of war and comparing it to the entertainment value that exists within the J.R.R. Tolkien trilogy of the Lord of the Rings. I'm quite serious about both of those, and I'd like to explain why I think that there is a significant connection, and also how that might lead us into thinking, as it did me about 12 years ago, into the ways in which business can contribute to peace, and perhaps avoid some of the horror that those young men were experiencing on a daily basis in Afghanistan. Now, Plato in the Republic wrote a small little vignette called The Ring of Gyges. It will sound familiar once I start talking to you a little bit about that, at least those of you who have watched some film and read some books that I will hold off on identifying for a moment. And in the Ring of Gyges, there were two people who were arguing with each other. There was Socrates, and his opposing partner was, in conversation, was Glaucon. So Glaucon told a story that he thought illustrated a point of how human beings are ethical or moral only because they're afraid of being caught. And so he told a story about a young shepherd boy who discovered in sort of the bowels of the earth after an earthquake had occurred a ring. The shepherd boy picked up the ring and then by accident put it on, or discovered that when he put it on, he suddenly seemed to become invisible to everybody else around him. Starting to sound familiar? So, and he experimented with this, and it was very consistent that whenever he put the ring on toward the inside, that he disappeared. And whenever he took it off or returned it to the outside, he reappeared. And once he realized that he had this power, the power to be invisible, the power to get away with really anything that he wanted to, because if you're invisible, you can get away with a lot. He then went to the capital, conspired with the king, or the queen, slept with the queen, conspired with her against to kill the king, take over the kingdom. And Glaucon's response, or an assessment of this, is that human beings will only be ethical or moral if they're afraid of being caught. If they think they will be able to get away with something, they will do anything they please. And Socrates responds to this of, first sort of sarcastically mocking him of how carefully he polishes up this example like it's some sort of a statue or something. It sort of creates the extreme case, if you will, that makes it seemingly hard to argue. But Socrates' point was that there is something in human nature as well that not only would seek to be ethical or moral for fear of being caught, but also because there are some noble dimensions to our human nature and to our human spirit. Now, and so in many of my classes, I have a debate of who's right, Glaucon or Socrates. And typically most of the small groups that engage in the argument end up concluding that it's a little bit of both. They're both right, that human nature is neither broodingly evil and destructive and getting away with whatever you can, nor is it purely noble and good and inspirational. There are times when we experience both of those in our lives, and it's a part of human nature to not be simple, but to be very complex. Now, the immediate analogy, of course, with the ring, and one of the things that J.R.R. Tolkien very much drew upon when he was writing Lord of the Rings, was this Ring of Gyges dialogue with Socratic dialogue between Glaucon and Socrates. And of course, in The Lord of the Rings, you see Frodo, who, as one of the least powerful people in existence of Middle Earth at the time, entrusted with the ring, in part because the less power that Frodo has, the less likely it is that he's going to be tempted to use it for his own purposes, as others, such as human beings, would be tempted to use it. And the story gives many examples of the temptations that human beings have. But even Frodo, this little hobbit, finds it intoxicating to have with them, and it's very difficult to get rid of it or to give it away or to throw it away. And of course, that was one of the things that created all the problems for another hobbit named Gollum. And much of the books are about the tension between Gollum and Frodo and Samwise and all those other characters, which are an elaboration in many ways of what you saw in the Platonic dialogue with Socrates and Glaucon. And of course, in the end, Frodo, I hope I'm not spoiling the movie for those of you who haven't seen the movie or read the book, but Frodo is unable to give it up. It's only in struggle that he has with Gollum that it falls into the fire and finally is destroyed. So even he couldn't finally give it away because it was such a powerful tug on him. But at the same time, even though it was powerful and there was a darkness to it, there was an evilness to it, there was this goodness to Frodo too. And so again, one of the themes was this complexity of human nature. Now, with that as background, I want to talk about Sebastian Junger's book and the documentary Restrepo that goes along with it. I found it very depressing and uplifting at the same time. I mean, depressing to see what these young men were going through on a daily basis with their lives on the line at every moment, with a surprise lurking at any potential moment, with the only way that you would have a chance of rooting out the enemy would be to walk out exposed into their territory, which makes you obviously much more of a target. And so there's this depressingness of what war looks like and the dangers that are associated with it and some of the deaths that go along with it or the other injuries that go along with it. At the same time, as has always been the case in war, there is an amazing amount of courage and camaraderie and toughness that goes along with these human beings who are in the midst of this situation that one would like to say, I wish that I could be like that as well. So again, you have a bit of complexity in there, but there's one particular thing that I want to focus on for a second, because in a different light, this was exactly how I started to get into the research of the ways in which business might be able to create peace. And that is, if you remember, there is a line in the book where Younger says that the men in that small little grouping, many of them hated each other, but would also die for each other in a moment. Now that's worth thinking about for just a second. Maybe that you hate somebody and you'll die for them at the same time. What's that about? Well, here's what it's about. Men in that organization, in that military unit, were in what are sometimes known as mediating institutions. And mediating institutions are these small organizations where there's a lot of face-to-face interaction, some egalitarian decision-making. Even if there's a hierarchy, there's egalitarian kind of decision-making and discussion about what to do. And most importantly, where one experiences the consequences of one's actions. And no matter, mediating institutions is a fancy sociological term for something that you all know. Mediating institutions are also your family, religious organizations, your neighborhood, voluntary associations, fraternities, sororities, classmates, and things like that. So they're places where if you do something, someone is going to react. And part of what your life is to find out how I adapt my behavior so that I am a member of this community, this mediated institution. And it doesn't mean that you have to love everybody in your institution, in your organization. It may be like the men in Afghanistan that you hate somebody else in your organization, but you recognize that your entire self-interest and self-nature is bound up in the well-being and the existence of somebody else. And so you recognize there's something beyond you that you have to prioritize in order for you to survive or to be successful. And there's that dynamic, there's a tension. what's in your self-interest is not to think of what's in your self-interest. What's in your self-interest is to think of what's in a larger group's self-interest, and that in turn is what ends up being better for you. Now, that's a dynamic that drives a lot of corporate responsibility thinking, because there's a lot of evidence out there that shows that in the long term, it is certainly possible to be ethical in business. You don't have to be. You might be able to be successful by being a jerk, but it's also a choice that you could be economically successful and profitable by behaving in a certain ethical way. So there's a choice that you have. It doesn't have to be one or the other. But those are all long-term studies. And in the short term, it always seems like you're better off to be able to get something if you can get away with it without being caught. But on the long term, you're recognizing that there is a larger grouping of employees, of customers, of society, of regulators, of suppliers, that you end up being more successful or your self-interest being better off if you sublimate your immediate self-interest in order to act for a larger common good. And then your longer-term self-interest is much better. Now that's one point that I think is worth thinking about, and I think that Younger's book illustrates that very nicely. The other thing is that when I was writing a book, and this is how my own experience of how I got into writing about business and peace, and you'll see that it's a different entry point, but it's not all that different either. It's a different specific example, but it's not necessarily a different different character of example. So I was writing a book at the time with Oxford University Press back in 1999, 2000 or so. And as I was writing a book of how to develop ethical corporate cultures. So not so much how to make ethical decisions, but how to build cultures so that those cultures and the communities will be making ethical decisions on a regular basis because it's just so much part of their nature. It becomes a habit to make good decisions because you've got these cultural attributes that bring to the fore the right kinds of questions and the permission to have discussions. You have interaction with each other so things aren't hidden, that you can talk about it. While you may have hierarchy, you have relatively, have a lot of egalitarian kind of a decision making, and people recognizing that their actions making a difference to the others who are around them. Therefore, they're more likely to act in an ethical way because those actions make a difference. If the organization is too big, people will figure my actions don't make a difference. What difference does one action make in a sea of other people? Well, even just listening to that brief description, I could go on to more depth, of course. In that brief description, you can see that that is a mediating institution, and that was the subtitle of the book. It was Ethics and Governance, Business as a Mediating Institution. And what you saw with Younger was a mediating institution. And actually, as I was doing reading in peace studies literature, which perhaps this is odd, but I happen to like just for fun to read books on that subject matter, I found that there were studies that were done by anthropologists that show that the attributes of relatively peaceful societies map very, very well with what I was talking about of how to build ethical business culture. And it was at that point that I had the aha moment, that I wonder if practicing certain kinds of relational values that one finds in a mediated institution would actually be a way to contribute to peace. And that is, fostered my research identity, my brand identity, if you will, with 3 books. I'm starting on my 4th one now, and I'm running 12 conferences and a lot of other articles and workforce, task force, and things like that that I've been involved with. Now, before I go into the things in which the ways in which business can contribute to peace, I want to go back to that very beginning example that I used. A mediated institution is a set of relationships that exist within a certain grouping. It does not necessarily mean that it's going to lead to peace. The mediated institutions could lead to a more effective fighting unit in Afghanistan. So I don't want to say necessarily that it leads to peace, because they can exist in different kinds of forms. But I am saying that practiced within a corporate context, within a certain kind of a context, that it can lead to the kinds of cultural building, not only within the organization, but in societies as well, that themselves can replicate what peaceful societies are. So if you take the small, the immediate institutions, and make that large, that I think has an opportunity to create more peace. Whereas I don't think that what you see in Afghanistan is the replication, or in many other places of the world either, is the replication of that kind of a peaceful society that exists on a societal level, or a peaceful community that exists on a societal level. And so I'm saying that if you take the practices that you saw even within the group in the younger book, or from my own research, and then ramp those up on a societal level, or replicate them on many other institutions, that you will create a culture that make it less likely that people are going to have to be in harm's way in Afghanistan. So, three things, or three ways ways in which corporations can contribute to peacefulness. One is economic development, probably the easiest one. There are studies both from the United Nations and the World Bank that shows that poverty is associated with violence, and I think that you see that pretty dramatically in Afghanistan. And some of the reasons are that if people are extremely poor, then the competition for scarce resources may be so severe that violence is the only way that you can obtain them in order to sustain yourself. That actually has received some criticism, whether that's actually true or not. But one that seems to be a little bit more solid is that if there is very high levels of poverty, there's also high levels of unemployment, and therefore those that are unemployed are very much open to the overtures of those who can provide them some sort of compensation, even if it's to plant a roadside bomb or to play on their frustrations in order to get them to ally with a particularly charismatic, militant kind of an approach to politics. Either way, there is clear associations between poverty and violence, and so one of the things that corporations can do is what corporations do best, and that is to create economic development, to create jobs, to provide managerial transfers so that if you're a global corporation and you go to an emerging market country, you teach them how to run a business well. Motorola was given a corporate award for corporate excellence award by the U.S. Secretary of State, which is given for those companies that have done so much to promote diplomatic relations between the U.S. and that other country, wherever it is located, because Motorola brought with it $1 billion worth of technology and also taught suppliers in Malaysia, as that particular award was given, to help them develop their businesses better so that they run their businesses better, which Motorola needed in order to have a reliable product supply in order to manufacture its products. And so there are things that multinational corporations in particular can do in order to make business practices around the world better. Now, I mentioned technology because there's another dimension of economic development that's worth mentioning, and that is that there are studies done, for instance, by Paul Collier, that show that one of the best predictors for a civil war is if the main export product of a country is an undifferentiated commodity such as timber, diamonds, oil, opium. And so to the extent that a business can differentiate the economy outside the extractives, and there's still things that extractives can do themselves, but if you can differentiate the economy beyond the extractives, you're more likely to create a society that moves the needle away from violence and toward peace. Second thing that corporations can do are associated with rule of law kinds of practices, and in particular avoidance of corruption, which we know from a lot of reports is a serious problem within Afghanistan itself. So I did a study a few years ago that showed a perfect correlation between corrupt societies and whether they resolve disputes violently or non-violently. And if you want more information of exactly how I did that, I'll be happy to provide that to you. But it showed that exactly those countries that are the most corrupt are the ones that are most likely to resolve disputes within their borders by violence, and those that are the least corrupt are the ones who are least likely to resort to violence in order to resolve their disputes. Now, it's a correlation, so there could be a third underlying factor that explains both of those. But you can imagine that if you have a systemically corrupt economic system, that the way that it is sustained is through some level of violence. Moreover, you can imagine the frustration that builds up within the society if it is continually corrupt. And the only way that you can sell your products is to bribe somebody. So, corporations sometimes will say, Tim, you've got all this stuff on business and peace. What do you want me to do? I'm just trying to make a buck. I said, well, one of the things you can do, and many corporations do them, the big three auto company do this a lot actually, is that they have a very strong corporate policy against bribery. so that the individual employee can go to the person asking for a bribe and say, you know, I'd love to give you a bribe. It would make me a happy boy to give you a bribe, but I'll get fired if I do. So you provide a corporate backbone for the individual to be able to refuse to pay the bribe. The more that you can make the economy based on a competition of price and quality and away from corruption and bribery, you are moving it away from a violent society. Similarly, if you have, to the extent that corporations and businesses can support dispute resolution mechanisms within the society, and this is almost a tautology, if you've got a dispute resolution mechanism within society that people can rely on, then they're less likely to use violence in order to resolve the disputes because they've got this other institution that they can use. Similarly, protection of contract rights and property rights. And you can see all these, or the lack thereof, in many war-torn countries, including Afghanistan. A protection of property and contract rights, or lack thereof, high degrees of corruption, and little ability to resolve the disputes except within the particular tribal level. So the second thing the corporations can do is to support rule of law practices, and in particular, avoid bribery. The third thing they can do is to practice this, what I call a sense of community. And there's two levels of that. One level of that is an external dimension, which is corporate social responsibility, corporate citizenship. It's about being generally respectful to the people in the area where you're doing business. Now, this actually is kind of a big thing in Reconstruction kinds of societies, where a corporation goes in. Are they respectful to the local citizens, to their religious beliefs, to their customs, to the environment? And so, are you the big bad outsider coming in just imposing your will, or are you respectful and listen and thoughtful and collaborative with those you are working with? Now, I'm not arguing that the corporation has a responsibility to feed all the hungry and to solve all violence from happening. And if they can do that, that's great. But I'm not talking about something that's extensive. What I'm talking about is being simply a good citizen that is a good neighbor to the society in which they're working. And I think that you see some of this in the book with some of the negotiations that occurred because the men in the military unit had killed the cow. Of exactly a real strong understanding, and maybe it should be even stronger, that you are in a society working with people, and and the military gets this actually pretty well. In some ways better than some economic development people that I've talked to. That the military can't get people to be incented to build an economy. They can provide security, which is important, but they need to find ways for people to feel that they have a stake in a developing post-conflict economy. And you can only do that by guns to some extent. At some level, people need to believe that if they invest, that there are going to be rewards, that their business is going to stay open, that they're not going to be bombed or it's not going to be seized. And nor do they want to simply be taking orders from what is perceived to be a colonial power. And so to the extent that you can empower them in their local aspirations for their own economic development, you're doing something quite strong by being respectful to the local community and respectful to their religious norms and customs and things like that. Another example, frankly, that I find a lot more interesting is the internal construction of your corporation. Is this an organization, a corporation, that practices those attributes of nonviolent societies? And I would argue that actually corporations can do that more easily, and already many times are already doing it, than one might think. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, to the extent that I'm going to draw on the quality management material of doing business. Quality management's been around for a long time now in different names. Total quality management, quality circles, Six Sigma, open book management. There's a lot of different variations of it. But they all require people up and down the business corporate ladder to speak up if they see a product defect, because it's a more efficient way of ending up with a quality product if you catch a defect early than if you wait until the end of a manufacturing cycle in order to identify it. So you want to do it early, but in order to do that, you have to have people speak up. Well, there's a dimension of self-governance when you do that. And again, I'm not talking about corporate democracy here. I'm just talking about in your work. If you're able to speak up, if you see a product defect, you're spotting a problem and you're trying to participate in the resolution of the problem to make for a better product. And I wonder, I challenge some of my empirical colleagues to chase down whether that experience of self-governance could spill over into the political society as well as a way to govern. And the reason that's so important is that there's many studies that show that democracy, which has the same dimension of voice as what I just described in quality management, are relatively more peaceful, or at least that they don't go war with each other. Democratic countries may go to war with non-democratic countries, but they typically don't go to war with each other. And voice is one of the central reasons that's given for that benefit. And so if corporations are actually enhancing voice, we think of corporations as being very hierarchical, but that's not necessarily the case. And if they're teaching people of how to self-govern through this quality mechanism, and maybe there are other mechanisms as well, I think that that is teaching a dimension of self-governance that itself would be beneficial in a society like Afghanistan or other places. Or another one, human rights. Lots of studies show that the more protection there is of human rights, the more peaceful the society is. Or I'll give you another one. Huge correlation between gender equity and nonviolence. Exactly those countries that give women more opportunity to work, to be promoted, to have strong careers, are exactly those countries that tend to move away from violence. Now, I'm not arguing that any one of these is a magic bullet. I think that you have to apply all of these things that I mentioned within the context of the reality of the society in which you're working. So I'm not going to say that we should march into Saudi Arabia and say that 50% of your employees ought to be women. There's going to be times and places for that. That may not be the argument that's going to win there, but I still think that even if you're talking to Saudi Arabia, there could be more that you could do in order to make sure that women are protected, or in other countries from honor deaths and things like that. And so there are the more you have an egalitarian treatment of both genders, the better off you are. Or to give one final example, the construction of the organizational style or structure itself. So that if you have, and this goes back to that original work that I was doing, if you put people in work groups, and there are magic numbers that are associated with some neurobiological breaking points where people are most comfortable in these kinds of groupings and less comfortable outside of these groupings, of roughly about 6, 30, and 150. If you put people in work groups of, let's say, 30 to keep it simple for right now, they're in a sizable work group that matches actually the biological heritage. It goes all the way back to hunter-gatherer times. Whereas if you ask people to work together in a group that's bigger than that, people again lose the sense that their actions make a difference. And so how a corporation structures its organization makes a difference of the way that people treat each other. And if you put people in organizations where they recognize they're in a relationship with each other, many kinds of virtues such as honesty, truth-telling, loyalty, courage come to the fore. And so all of these dimensions of how you structure the actual community that we call a corporation can replicate a relatively nonviolent societies and give not only messages but experiences to people that they might be able to apply both within the corporation and outside of the corporation with real specific benefits. So I think that you could take all of those, the economic development, the rule of law, the community dimension to them, and look at the situation that those young men were facing in Afghanistan and say that if there was a greater practice of those, first from corporations, although I'm not saying that corporations are going to solve the world's violence problem, but I think that they can play a bigger role than what you might think, that I think we would avoid some of those Afghanistan kind of situations. And the model for what that looked like is one that I've articulated here, and I think you can also look back into the Sebastian Junger book and see that the way that those young men were interacting within their own little community are examples that, if magnified, would be a way that we could very much make it less likely that they're in that kind of a position with their lives at stake.